in the media, if it bleeds, it leads. And so it's always the edge cases that get all of the scope of attention. And unfortunately, people take that, they socialize it through social media, and it gets distorted. And somehow you suddenly believe that every single one of the 10,000 jurisdictions across 3,300 counties in 50 states and 5 territories are corrupt. And it is hogwash. It's bull. It's not true. The staff, the professional staff there are nonpartisan because they're professional staff and they're patriotic in the best way that I personally, for over 17 years, have witnessed. Are there people who are going to challenge stuff? Are there people who can go rogue? Well, unfortunately, you've seen that. Is there an opportunity in 24 for some serious infection of the operations with people who maybe have alternative agendas? Frightfully, yes. But on the whole, the people here are good.
Welcome back to the Vetted Conversations podcast,
where we delve into the foundations, workings, and current challenges to the American way of self-governance.
In today's confusing world, it's more important than ever to understand how our government works and how we, as citizens, can actively participate in the discussion to safeguard our liberties and continued freedom.
Our mission is to ensure you, our listeners, have the knowledge and insights needed to become more informed and engaged citizens and active members of your communities. So let's get into it. Based on your feedback, we're adding a short civics discussion to the front of each episode to help better explain how our government is organized and how it's designed to work so that we all can more effectively engage with our elected and appointed officials to help create a more perfect union. Joining us today is Dr. Shawn Healy, a civics expert and the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy at iCivics. And he's going to answer the question, what is the purpose of the Electoral College in the U.S. presidential elections?
So our framers of the Constitution were very concerned about the excesses of democracy and took several steps in our Constitution to basically put a layer between the people and our government and our elected officials. So they created this, what they considered a deliberative body called the Electoral College. So this layer between the popular vote and the presidency. They once again involve states. So states are vital to the design of our Constitution. So states are represented in that Electoral College. Every state has 2 senators, right? So every state gets 2 electoral votes and then 1 electoral vote for each member of Congress. Of course, our smallest states have only 1 member of Congress. Some of our larger states have dozens of members of Congress. So states have different electoral vote calculations. And then our framers delegated to Congress, to states, the ability to determine how those electoral votes are awarded. If you fast forward to present day, almost every state, in fact, 48 states, whatever state wins the popular vote, ultimately gets those electoral votes for the state. In the case of Nebraska and Maine, those votes are awarded by congressional districts. So the winner of the state gets 2 electoral votes. Nebraska has 3 congressional districts, so each congressional district is 1 electoral vote. So if you go to, for example, the 2020 election, former President Trump won Nebraska, won 2 of the congressional districts. President Biden won the Omaha area district. So Trump gets 4 electoral votes. Biden gets 1. There were also concerns kind of going back to the founding debates about regional candidates. So this is obviously a different time. It's before this era of TV and the internet, where there were concerns that there would be regional candidates that we wouldn't all know about. So we needed this wise body of elders to kind of sort through all of that. Of course, that's less of an issue nowadays. Some of the critiques of the Electoral College, of course, is we have had 5 instances in our history where a candidate wins the popular vote but loses the electoral vote, and a couple of times very recently, right, in 2000, right. 2016, where that is the case. So there have been efforts, there have been debates about whether the Electoral College is a relic of the past. It's certainly in the modern vernacular benefits the Republican Party over the Democratic Party, and that's just because of how party supporters are distributed. But rural states, particularly in the nation's interior, have disproportionate representation in that Electoral College because of the two Senate issue. So there's some structural advantages in the modern vernacular for Republicans. And last part I'll say is if the defenders of the Electoral College, even in a modern context, are concerned that if we would do away with it, we would this would be less of a national campaign, probably be much more focused on major metropolitan areas. The detractors come back and say, hey, 2024 election, for example, we're focused on 6 or 7 states, probably, right? So there's 43 states that we're already writing off. There's only about 10 or so states that have been competitive this century. So it really has narrowed the scope. But I think it is right if we would go with just a sheer popular vote. Some of those states probably wouldn't be as prominent, right? So Wisconsin is going to be the center of the universe in this coming year. The Republican convention is there. It was the tipping point state in 2020. I doubt Wisconsin gets as much attention if we go just on the basis of the popular vote.
Okay, so what I hear is that we're voting for candidates, but in effect, what we're really doing is voting for electors who will carry that consensus to Congress, and hopefully cast their votes in accordance with the will of the people from the state which they represent.
Right. So yeah, there are different slates of electors at the state level. Whoever wins that state, those electors ultimately meet in December, and they send those votes to Congress, and Congress ultimately certifies that vote in January, a couple weeks out before the presidential inauguration. For the most part, electors are faithful. There have been some cases in recent years where a handful of called unfaithful electors where they kind of go their own way. But because these are slates, and they're often slates of party faithfuls, there's very little of that. So there was certainly more autonomy in the past, and I think that by design. But as I said, in the modern context, those 48 states basically direct the popular vote winner of that state to vote for the winning candidate, and then some variability in Maine and Nebraska.
Awesome. No, thanks for that. I really appreciate it.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Joe Plensler, and today we're diving into a topic that impacts every voter: election security. With technology advancing at lightning speed and new threats emerging every day, how do we ensure our elections remain fair and free from interference? From cyber threats to misinformation campaigns, securing our elections is more critical and more challenging than ever before. Today, election security expert and military family member Greg Miller, one of the co-founders of the Open Source Election Technology Institute, joins Ellen and me to discuss. So let's get started and unravel the complex world of election security.
Greg, thanks so much for joining us. It's always fun to hear that someone that's coming to talk to us has some military connection, especially for me as a military spouse. Can you tell a little bit about your American story and especially how it ties into your connection as a military family member?
Sure. It's kind of a multifaceted story, and thank you so much for having me. We are huge fans of your organization and what you folks are doing. My story is sort of divided between my parents' horrific journey from Germany to get here. I have to say that I haven't been real comfortable telling that story until people have been urging me and coaching me that it's time for me to start doing that. And so I'm always like, oh yeah, somebody put that in a bio someplace, because you kind of caught me off guard, Ellen, when you mentioned that you'd read about it. The real quick side of there is that I am the son of German immigrants in 38 and 39. My late parents were Holocaust survivors. My father's family was Jewish. My mother's family is Catholic. I like to tell people we know guilt like Bo knows football. But it was a very difficult journey for my father's family. I only recently learned that my mother's family made it out thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt, who had a friend in the U.S. Embassy in Paris that made possible my mother's family the Luftquist passage back. And for my father, they had already been here in the United States and had gone back to Germany. So it was their second immigration. Unfortunately, they had some people that made it possible for them to get in here. But as you all know, thanks to Charles Lindbergh and others, it was very difficult for Jewish immigrants, any immigrants from Germany at that time. My father was very much a patriot. He was incredibly pleased and happy to have made it to the United States and to have survived, having lost his father and two brothers who were interned at Dachau and then ultimately were transferred to Nuremberg. So he was very lucky to get his mother out and a sister. And so he's a big patriot. And so when my brother came along, who was older than me, 12 years older than me, post World War II, pushed him to serve, which he was excited to do. My brother actually started out in the Navy. He was on USS Blueback, and then spent some time tooling around the North Pole on the Nautilus, and then went to Cal Berkeley as Vietnam was breaking out. He had an F card, so he should have had no reason to go back in, but some things happened with a girlfriend who was caught up with a group called the Weathermen. And he took the fall for that incident and said it was my fault. And they said, great. Oh, we see you've been in service before. So they said, we're not going to prosecute you. We're just going to throw you back in. He said, great. What do you want to do? He paused, thinking about it. And they said, okay, we'll decide for you. And next thing my brother knew was he was learning how to land aircraft on a painted deck on the Alameda Air Naval Station in East Bay before he would be deployed to the Coral Sea. So my brother flew out of the USS Coral Sea early on and then was transferred over to the Essex CVA 9 and then the Yorktown. So he was technically part of the Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club in Vietnam. 16th of April, 72 was a day I'll never forget. My brother was back on the Coral Sea. They flew like 6 dozen sorties out of Haiphong, covering for B-52s. When he lost most of his command there, most of his planes, and he was ultimately shot down, was POW MIA, came wandering back in 1975 after the baby lift out. So a long journey there. Wow. And thank you for letting me share that story. I don't get to share it too often, and that took up a lot of time. But so that's my connection. My mother begged me not to go in because I was going right after my brother. I wanted desperately to fly. She talked me out of it and said, finish college, do the right thing. So my brother
amazing.
did get back.
It's amazing. He went from being a submariner to a surface warfare.
Is that not diversity, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, definitely mobility within the service, right, within the Navy. Right. But I think you bring up a good point, and something that Ellen and I talk quite a bit about is that there's many ways to serve our country. A lot of times we hear about service and people think of the military. And as a veteran, I like to try to adjust that thinking a little bit and say, well, don't our police officers serve our country? Don't our school teachers and librarians serve our country and communities? And they absolutely do.
Amen.
So, this may be a good segue into the open source Election Technology Institute and why you decided to create this. I understand you're the co-founder. Could you give us a little bit of that origin story?
Yeah, so you nailed it spot on about the service and how you serve, and this is kind of a tribute to my late parents. The mission of the OSET Institute, which does stand for Open Source Election Technology, is to increase confidence in elections and their outcomes, in defense of democracy as a matter of national security. That's the mission statement, cold. We got started in 2006 when post Netscape, I was in a venture capital firm. And we discovered that the commercial industry for producing election administration technology was really messed up. And this is in 2006. We right away identified that it was a highly concentrated industry with literally no commercial incentive whatsoever to produce the kinds of innovations we need to have an infrastructure that can achieve something called the vast mandate. For elections officials, so an election is said to be trustworthy if and only if it is verifiable, accurate, secure, and transparent in process. If those four corners test is true, then you have the grounds for a trustworthy election. The hardware and software that comprises voting machinery today can barely meet two of those legs, barely. We had a lot of learning from our experience at Apple, Netscape, Sun Microsystems, Google, the companies where all of us came from that formed the OSIT Institute in 2006. And the reason, Joe, we formed it was we weren't going to succumb to the same problems of the commercial sector. If you came to me as a venture capitalist in '06 and said, I have a great idea for a truly vast voting system, would you fund my startup company to do it? There's no way we would touch that. It's a terrible business opportunity, right? Let's face it. The U.S. market for this stuff in total is about $330 million a year.
Right.
Globally, it's about $3 billion. But gosh, pardon my phraseology here, but it's mouse nuts for institutional venture capital. It just doesn't even move a needle. And yet, I think, as you and I have talked about in the past, Joe, this is critical democracy infrastructure. I mean, okay, so it's a small, tiny niche industry, but we're talking about something really important. And so at that point, we said, you know what? We learned a lot in our careers in the tech sector and the commercial sector about the value of public technology, open source. And that's what triggered us to get started. Yeah. So really, it's about catalyzing infrastructure improvements where it's not commercially feasible to do so. And then there's a family legacy purpose, frankly. I get a little bit choked up talking about this, so I'll make it brief. But having finally got the stories from my parents about what they went through and what they witnessed, my dad's family was ripped apart. His father was a supporter of the Browns. They actually thought that the Browns were giving everybody work, that things were going great. It was, we were protecting our borders, building this infrastructure, and they did not see frog in the boiling pot, what was happening around them with the rise and change of the megalomaniac Adolf Hitler. The point was, there was what seemed like a reasonable government, and they watched it collapse and implode on itself and turn into an autocracy when everybody kept saying, no, don't. You know what? The guy bloviates. Just don't worry about his shouting. Just really worry about what he actually does. And nobody believed that Hitler was going to be a problem, including my grandfather, until it was too late.
Right.
And by the way, as you know, it wasn't just the Jews, because my mother's family was Catholic, and they realized they had to get out, and they flipped the keys to their plants to other friends to continue the work, and they left.
Yeah, in 2015, I took some colleagues to the Holocaust Museum, and there's newsreels of a certain Austrian former corporal, who was leading Germany, up on the lectern screaming about making Germany great again. And I took notice of that. In 2015, 2016 timeframe. It was interesting. Yeah. When we talk about like the state of American elections, like where are we today?
So, when I look at the current state of American elections, I like to go back to what we use here as the 5 Ps ecosystem of democracy administration. So the 5 Ps are people, process, platform, policy, and politics. Okay. So if we look at it from there, we have massive trust issues with the platform. It's an aged out, vulnerable infrastructure, and it works so long as the physical perimeter security is in place. Right. We saw that in Coffee County get dissolved. There are equally massive issues with people and process, right? And then you have this hyper partisanship and loss of focus that's ended up, it's completely upended policy, and the politics are what they are. So all that said, though, after 17 years of the OSIT Institute, I can tell you that elections are sound, reliable, and as far as we know, they haven't been compromised. I'm happy to talk about the as far as we know part, but they have not been compromised. Yeah. That's where we are today.
So it's amazing to hear someone who's sitting, behind the scenes, understanding deeply the technology. It's interesting to hear you say that there are deep challenges, and yet it seems like what you're also saying is that there are enough checks and balances that despite those challenges, our elections are still secure.
Yeah, and I like to put it in the analogy of an automobile, right? So we're American election infrastructure is a '67 Valiant driving in an age of cars with automatic brakes and far more powerful engines and all of that, right? And so you have a good handbrake and you use it when you have to, but that Dodge Valiant can still get along. The question is, at what point does antiquity become obsolescence? Right. And that's where we are now.
Yeah. I mean, I sat down through our county's refresher training for election officials because our elections are coming up for the primaries on Tuesday. So there were about 80 citizens there. About half of them were veterans or military family members. And as our county registrar was going through the refresher training on the processes and procedures, it was almost like what was ringing in the back of my head was military general orders, like take charge of this post and all government property in view being general order number 1. To walk my post in a military manner, being always on the alert. I mean, these things that are drilled into us, you talk about physical security. I mean, that's very much a huge imperative to have like two-party integrity around every piece of voting equipment to make sure that no one person is ever left alone with anything in the polling station. But I think what the value I see, especially in technical solutions, is that human beings are frail, right? We're flawed. We have perception gaps, and that's where we can leverage advanced technologies to help make things even better, right? Not that it's so terrible now because it's working and functioning and it's safe and secure, but like how can we leverage technology to improve and learn and grow?
Sure. And I got to say that, I'd love to talk more about the process and protocol that you go through, because this goes back to, what we've spoken about before, the notion of critical democracy infrastructure, the critical infrastructure designation, people recognizing that voting equipment is tantamount to national security operating assets, which,
right.
Oh, wow, that means that people who are operating those machines are operators of national security assets. And so there should be process and protocol around that takes a discipline, a regiment. I'm a small single engine pilot, and we go through steps every time we prepare that plane to get off the ground. I've had people say, "Why are you doing that?" It's like 6:00 in the morning, and it's like, because you do these things every time for a reason. Because that consistency is what breeds the safety of it. You mentioned physical perimeter, and I just want to say that this is our biggest problem now, right? Is that after Coffee County, after actually 4 other counties across the country, where we had elections officials go rogue, flip the keys to an unauthorized individual who came in and took that equipment out of those physical warehouses to hotels to disassemble them, image the discs, and then publish that information on the dark web. WTAF, as my friend's son would say. I mean, this is crazy. And so now, what does that mean? Well, what it means is I now have an easy way to go construct a vector, a piece of malware that I could mount on a USB stick, right? And just like Stuxnet, if I now have an individual who's got the right coat and the right looking badge and the right, maybe even AI robot call to get authorization to get into that building, now, once I've plugged that stick into that machine, all bets are off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we can't stop the stick, but we can stop the access. And so really it's about that physical perimeter, and folks like yourself understand that better than anybody.
Yeah.
But let me get back to your question, which was,
please.
How do we grow and improve this? Look, this is worth an entire conversation alone, but at a high level, I think there's 4 things. I think we properly have to fund research and development, right? If this equipment is national security assets of a critical infrastructure, the federal government should stop pumping money into ad hoc little programs that they dole out to the states with all kinds of strings about, how you can do anything you want with the money, and actually set aside a federal research and development fund, either at DARPA or at NSF or someplace, to allow the kinds of work that we and about 6 other projects around the country are undertaking to get to a better place with technology. Second thing is we have to embrace transparency in that infrastructure. Transparency builds trust, right? And which actually I should say transparency builds belief. I like to tell people that trust is what black box proprietary systems demand. Belief is what glass box open systems delivers. So that transparency quotient. Number 3, I think, is really properly implementing the critical infrastructure designation that Secretary Jay Johnson did under a prior administration, the Obama administration, just before it was transferred over to Trump. It was an agency designation, though, from DHS. Not nearly as strong as codifying it in 6 USC. And so on our government relations side of our work, we're big proponents of codifying this designation. And why is that important? Because if that's important, then we can begin treating elections professionals like they should be treated, as licensed professionals. We can pay them properly. We can train them properly. And then I'm hoping that folks like your organization can begin to see that as their next career. Right. Finally, I think we have to evolve, and this goes a follow-on from number 3, is I think we have to evolve election administration into a licensed profession. I mean, today we're counting on poll workers and as a volunteer corps that are basically seasonal workers, right? And then you've got another core of people who supervise them who are more staff. We have got to upgrade that. Now, there's efforts underway to teach people the things they need to do to become an election professional, but we think it should go further. We think there should be a certification process, there should be a licensing process, and they should be paid for that accordingly. What's happening now, and this is really important for a major news platform, we're just finishing a 50-state study of every single county's election worker turnover and the cause of that turnover and who's replacing them. I got some really scary news for you.
Yeah, that's something we're really passionate about with some of our work in our Vet the Vote coalition, is that, we're trying to build new norms, not only for the volunteer poll workers who come out, year on year to do this important job, but also for the staff. There should be a better pipeline, sort of, we're calling it sort of service to service. How do you get people that leave the military to do these really important, more local civic jobs? Because they require the kind of discipline and training.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Boy, I'll tell you, and if we weren't so wrapped around the axle of what we're doing with technology here, I would be throwing every ounce of resource we had behind you to make that happen. Because if there is a soft spot, if there's a blind spot, Joe, in this place, in the people, process, platform, policy, politics, it's the people quotient. And we're not good social engineers. But lastly, I wanted to point out that on the growth and learning side, I think we need to implement process audits. And we should mandate post-election risk limiting audits for the ballots. But another thing that's not talked about much is process audit. There should be a process by which we conduct an audit of how everything was handled all the way through. What was the provenance and stewardship of the ballots? What were all the steps that were taken? Because this is the attack vectors for people who are either don't trust elections or are mendaciously trying to get misinformation injected into the conversation by attacking the process, right? Oh, those weren't candies. They were USB sticks. Oh, those weren't ballots from the mail service. Those were stuffed ballots that were injected in the system. That crap's got to stop.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because like the four main pieces of equipment that are in a polling station, for anyone who's never really paid attention to that, is the poll book. So when you check in, the computers by which you look up to see whether someone's registered with the county as a voter, and if their address matches their ID and so on and so forth, right? And and if they voted before in that election, right? Because it will show up if they voted by absentee ballot and sent one in, or they voted in early voting, it will account for that, right? The second thing is, if in some counties have ballot marking devices, if people don't want to sit down and fill in the number 2 pencil or ink pen,
and mark the ballot
circles, and then some counties just use that ballot marking device for people with disabilities and so on and so forth. The third thing is the actual ballot counting machine, like that little R2D2 looking like thing where you feed your ballot in that tabulates things and prints out the report and collects the paper ballot. And then the fourth thing is an internal off internet network that rides on its own system with military grade encryption to talk back to the county office. So those are like the four main technological systems I'm aware of. I'm curious though, like, is there anything out there that's new? I mean, we're hearing about blockchain technology, we're hearing about all sorts of things. And when you look at financial services, trillions of dollars every year are transmitted electronically across billions of transactions through secure means. So is there a way that maybe one day we'll vote on our phones safe and securely, or deployed military members from the far edges of the frontier, like, pull out a cell phone or a sat phone and vote that way?
Well, so a day wouldn't go by properly if I'm not asked that question. So thank you for making sure today is consistent with all the others. So a couple things. I believe that military and overseas voters are a different class of voters, and their special circumstances, especially in theater, demand that they have opportunities. Look, they're willing to risk live bullets. They should be able to risk live ballots. And so I think that the proving ground for digital technologies that surround the transaction of a ballot, that's where the military and theaters where that should happen first. Secondly, let me just say that there is no technology infrastructure today that can safely, securely do that and achieve the vast mandate. There's no way today to do that. There are opportunities in the future. We've got some classified work underway here that suggests there is a possibility in the future. I'm willing to tease that out in a moment. I can't say too much about it. But what I do want to say to you, and Joe, this is really important because you're very good at telling the story about financial transactions and what's the difference. And the difference is huge. Okay. So the thing with financial transactions is we have this concept of repudiation, right? So I have to have the ability to prove that I did not authorize that transaction and back it out and have my bank cover the illegal illicit charges on my card, right?
Okay. Right.
Ballots don't get a mulligan. There is no non-repudiation. Under the American system of elections, my ballot must be absolutely anonymized and absolutely secret. There has to be no way that I can ever connect Ellen with her ballot across the cloud. And today, that is technologically impossible. And so that's what's holding us up on getting to the smartphone voting. Now, that said, I'll tease a project I would love to see properly funded here. We have an engineer here who has actually stumbled upon a way to possibly do this. My clue to you, my hint to you will be it's hardware. It won't be done in pure software. And so you say, well, gosh darn, I have my phone. Isn't that the hardware? And I will tell you, no, that's not it. And then if you want to push me, I'll say, I want you to think the next time you go to your favorite sandwich stand, food truck, or restaurant, and they have a way of taking payment digitally with their phone. Think about how they do that when you hand over your card. And now you're on to the pathway that we may have in the future. And I've said more than I can about that topic.
Okay.
But what other innovations are happening here? So here at the OSINT Institute, we're working on something called Trusted Boot with hardware attestation. I need a way to be able to prove that the hardware is secured and hasn't been touched. And we need to be able to do that so that we can use off-the-shelf hardware to keep the cost down. I mean, let's face it. We're going to build custom foundries to ensure that the avionics in an F-35 are not born of Asian components. We can afford to do that because that's what's at stake in an F-35. You're not going to build custom hardware for voting machines, although it's critical infrastructure. So what we have done and what is the state of the art right now that we're working on is this concept of having a device that can actually test the hardware before it's activated or put into service. Now you work in a polling place, so you know what LAT is. And you know that the logic and accuracy testing goes before you start any election process. Well, imagine if you had a key that hung about your neck that had a biometric authenticator on it that allowed you to plug into a device and verify that device had not been compromised and was ready to be loaded with its software for today's action. Yeah. That is how you start getting to a more secure process. We're working on that one. I would argue that the ElectOS architecture, right, the flagship project of the Trust the Vote project is something called ElectOS. ElectOS is for voting machines, what Android is for smartphones. That's what the ElectOS project is about. You mentioned blockchain. As long as we're not talking about transacting ballots, sure. Digital ledgers are critically important to basically produce evidence of lots of things, like blockchains for voter registration records, blockchains for all EMS transactions. So blockchain technology, or what we call digital ledgering, has a lot of upside here. And we have built a project that we've shown CISA that actually is called Vanadium, which is a prophylactic for voter registration databases, those that were compromised in 16, 17. So blockchain has a role, not transacting ballots yet. Finally, I would say, believe it or not, artificial intelligence. We have big project here on AI, generative AI, for positive use. The quickest example I can give you is an infinitely scalable call center replacement for elections officials. An agent we're building called Ella. And Ella will have a conversation with you about any question you have about elections, flagging those things that sound a bit potentially as disinfo or misinfo, and correct you. So Trusted Boot, the ElectOS architecture, blockchain for ledgering, and AI are the four things that we see as new innovations.
Yeah, super exciting stuff. And I just saw in Stars and Stripes earlier this month that there's a DARPA-funded project. There's a prototype going out of a deployable voting machine unveiled to the National Association of Secretaries of State. It was presented to a couple weeks ago. So somewhere the military and DARPA is taking a look at using some sort of technology to help deployed
And
service
Joe,
member to vote. Yeah.
Joe,
Uh-huh.
our CTO is on that project.
Got it. Okay.
So
It's called the
so
SIF project.
okay, so you guys
So
are
we worked on SIF.
so you guys are totally nerding out about technology for voting, which is incredibly
Yeah.
important in our current how every state obviously votes differently, uses different machines, and
Yes.
that's how it's supposed to be according to the Constitution. But one thing that I'm interested in is that in general, even someone like you who has a deeper understanding of the challenges to the machines, and the and how the economics are playing into it, which make total sense. I mean, who has the incentive to play in this very tiny market? But what's your sense of the people? Because that's the other side of it, as you said. You said the people can be in many ways problematic, and you've given examples of stolen machines and bad behavior. But across the American election system, what is your general sense of the people, the humans who execute it?
Thank you for asking that, Ellen, because one of the things that we've done at the OSIT Institute over the 17 years of our existence and the 70 people that we have is that all of us volunteer and work in polling places in order to truly understand the technology engineering tasks that we have at hand. I have walked polling places for years. I have sort of witnessed that whole infrastructure of people. Here's one thing I am absolutely convinced of. We have some incredibly loyal patriots trying their damn best to do the right thing all over this country. And they're unfortunately in the media, if it bleeds, it leads. And so it's always the edge cases that get all of the scope of attention. And unfortunately, people take that, they socialize it through social media, and it gets distorted. And somehow you suddenly believe that every single one of the 10,000 jurisdictions across 3,300 counties in 50 states and 5 territories are corrupt. And it is hogwash. It's bull. It's not true. The professional staff there are nonpartisan because they're professional staff and they are patriotic in the best way that I personally, for over 17 years, have witnessed. Are there people who are going to challenge stuff? Are there people who can go rogue? Well, unfortunately, you've seen that. Is there an opportunity in 24 for some serious infection of the operations with people who maybe have alternative agendas? Frightfully, yes. But on the whole, the people here are good. What I want to see is more of that systemically through. Professionalize and certify the professionals, bring in the vets. I personally think that there is a tremendous, post-service, first service opportunity as deploying into election administrations, the second one. I've talked with military folk, and Joe, you and I have talked about this. You have to do that right. You have to do that delicately. You're not going to come in wearing your fatigues. You don't have to, right? But there is a post-military service opportunity here, and I would love to see the tens of thousands of vets find a way to serve their country at the next stage, to kind of sort of balance out what they were doing the first time.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, at the SNAP poll last night, I mean, I wasn't surprised when I asked all 80 people getting training, I'm like, how many of you are veterans or military family members? And half the hands went up, and that's consistent with kind of Ellen's prognostications of what we think nationwide the data is. So we are very eager to tell America, if you're going to vote, chances are you're being helped. At least one of 3 of those people volunteering there is probably a veteran or military family member.
I'm going to make sure our comms people tweet some of this later today, because that is so gratifying to hear that, a show of hands revealed that half of those folks in training are ex-military, because that is what we need.
Yeah, it was heartening to see, and just what a great way for veterans in the community to reconnect. This is an important topic, because I think one of the things that Ellen's brought up before and that you've kind of hit on, Greg, but I just really want to punch out for any listeners out there is that the federalized system of our government, where each state is responsible for its own elections and each county is responsible to its state for its own elections, is kind of like the strength of the system, because there's no one network or no one place any foreign adversary can hack into, right? They would have to individually go to each, 10,000 municipalities to do that. And it's a really hard task. Plus the stuff's not plugged into the internet to begin with. So you can't hack into it, right?
Joe, can I spar with you a little bit on that?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to spar. I want to push back just a little there.
Sure,
There's a
please.
common misconception that the highly distributed, balkanized nature of our election infrastructure is the very key to its protection, and that is
Okay.
false. And
Tell
the
me more.
reason it is false is that I don't need a widespread attack on an election to cause the chaos and disruption necessary. I
Yeah,
only
it's true.
need to attack a highly contentious swing state, set of polls that could throw that state into disarray, maybe two or
Yeah.
three of those states. And remember, first to 270. So I don't have to have widespread access. I only need to hit those states where I think I can cause the most damage. And it's even worse than that. I don't actually have to hit them. I just have to make you think I did.
Right. Yeah, because the impression of the threat is as good as the threat itself in this instance.
Yeah. So please just remember that balkanization and highly distributed by design is a feature, but it is not a prophylactic, because I don't need to have. If this was, quote, an American election, but as Ellen properly points out, 2 articles and 7 amendments to the Constitution make clear that elections are a state's matter with a federal interest, states' right, federal interest. That's it. So we don't have one American election. That's why we don't have one popular vote. If we did, yeah. And even then, we'd attack the highest concentrated areas where there's the most contentious, competition, those swing states. Yeah. So just wanted to push back a little bit on that, because we all say it and we say, yeah, but wait a minute. No, it's not. And by the way, all the equipment itself too is, yes, there are 3 different vendors. There are about 9 different platform designs. All of them share common characteristics.
Yeah.
And they all have the same weak spots.
Okay. No, I'm glad we had this conversation, because these are important points, and even highlights the need, until we come up with better technical solutions, for the physical security provided by the volunteers. So cannot
overemphasize the importance of people in this ecosystem. And remember, then there's only so much we can do in the field, and the field is where we're going to have to do it right, because we now are faced with the fact that we're hearing through my government relations team. I maintain a board that is equally distributed between libertarians, Democrats, and Republicans. Everyone checks their animal at the door. We're all pro-democracy. But the good news is I get to hear intel from across the spectrum. And the thing that's concerning me right now is that there are more than 2 states who have privately said within their legislature, if it becomes necessary to ensure a particular candidate wins, we are willing to take the legislative steps to introduce our own electors.
Oof.
Now, just marinate on that for a moment. A state legislature is saying that they are willing to tell the people of their state that, notwithstanding their will, the legislature is going to send a different slate of electors on January 6th to ensure that a particular candidate wins. This is the greatest risk to this grand experiment that's approaching its 250th birthday. So how do we fix that? Well, the only way we can counter that is to have such a high turnout election with such a great deal of participation across the spectrum, with such a good level of process in administering that election at the field level, that there can be no question that if a state's legislature decides that they're going to go against the will of their own people just so their candidate can win, that it is almost impossible to do so, because the turnout and the counts are so compelling that nobody's going to stand for that.
Wow. That's sobering.
Yeah.
It's disturbing. It's disturbing. But if for those who are hacks at this stuff, if you paid attention to all of the sub meetings at CPAC last week, you walked away. I had Republican board members walk away shaking. We have just a few people who are managing to produce the tail wagging the dog problem.
Well, we've
got to work in the field.
We are super lucky and I would say rare as military family and veteran community members, where we are so often surrounded by folks that, even with different partisan feelings and strong opinions and political goals, we see every day how people can work together for America's big goals. And that is what the military does. People work together across a lot of different lines, and they just get the job done that America needs. And that is exactly the type of energy we see in elevating and bringing more of the veteran and military family community to our elections. One thing we joke about, Greg, that you'll find amusing is, the data is very clear that a lot of poll workers are people over 65, and especially women over 65.
Right.
And we believe that many of those people, many of those women, are probably married to Vietnam vets or were married to Vietnam vets, and that many of those men were in the service. And so, we already see a huge concentration of our community in those positions that are so incredibly important, and that makes us feel really good about our elections.
This is the single most important mission in terms of how we go to the 24 election. It's the field. It's going to be at the field level that we execute to ensure pro-democracy. I can sit here and honestly say that I have no care about who wins. I only care that the election is conducted freely and fairly, and it is verifiable, accurate, secure, and transparent in process, so that we can restore belief in elections, because it's central to our democracy. It's central to this grand experiment. So I hope that that veterans become a major factor in election administration.
Well, thank you so much for that perfect ending to this incredibly educational conversation. And we are so glad that there are tech nerds from Silicon Valley, working on these these really important processes and products and systems. So thank you so much for joining us and giving us a really amazing education. And we, again, are so excited to see what comes in the future. We know that Trust the Vote is a way that people can get involved. We also, of course, want our community to vet the vote. So two ways to engage with the vote coming off of this podcast. But thanks again for your incredible work on our democracy.
As part of Season 2, we want to provide veterans a way of getting more involved in their communities to advocate for the issues they care about. To do this, we are featuring veteran organizations that we think you might be interested in. Today's spotlight is on Mission Roll Call, and representing them today is Cole Lyle. Cole is a U.S. Marine Corps veteran and current executive director of Mission Roll Call. He and I first met when he was a legislative director at the American Legion, and since then he's been a military legislative assistant at the U.S. Senate and a special assistant to the Secretary for Legislative Affairs at the Department of Veterans Affairs. He's also known for his work advocating for service dogs for veterans, and he is the author of the Pause Act. He's also a founder of Kaya's Canines and is a board member of Warrior Ranch. So Cole, welcome. Where in the country are you and how are you doing?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I am in Alexandria, just outside of D.C., doing really well. The organization is off and running for the year. We just testified in front of the House and Senate Veterans Affairs Committee joint hearing 2 weeks ago. So we are off and running for the year.
Awesome. Yeah, I saw that post on LinkedIn where your CEO was up on the panel. I want to get into that, but before we do, can you tell me, essentially, what is the mission of Mission Roll Call?
Yeah, so Mission Roll Call, listeners may or may not know, right, that less than 50% of veterans in the country are enrolled in VA healthcare, use VA benefits, or are associated with a veteran service organization. So, if only half of us are being included in the policy conversations at the national level, we're missing out on valuable perspectives across the country from only half the community. So our mission is to be the voice of veterans in the United States, but all veterans. So veterans that don't necessarily use traditional VSOs, or not enrolled in the VHA, or use veteran benefits, and give them an unfiltered voice to policymakers in Washington, D.C., at the White House, on Capitol Hill, and then tell some of their stories. So that's essentially the mission. We do this through. You can go to missionrollcall.org and sign up for these polls that we send out. If Congress or the VA, for instance, is advocating for some change to veteran policy, We poll the veterans in our community about what they think about that policy and what that proposed change would do for them. And then we instantaneously provide that feedback to those policymakers. So you and I both worked at the Legion. You skip through the local post, the state convention, the national convention, the DC office, and it's really a direct voice from the veteran to the policymaker.
That's awesome. It sounds like you're cutting out several layers of bureaucracy and middle people.
Yeah. I mean, and not casting aspersions on the Legion or the VFW or anything. They do great work and they serve their purpose, but oftentimes the individual veteran can feel like their voice is being filtered and not heard directly. So that's kind of, generally speaking, the mission. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think anytime the word goes up the chain, right, it changes at each level with each reiteration of the storytelling. But you bring up a good point. Like I think most people think that almost every veteran is enrolled in the VA and gets services through the VA. What might be preventing veterans from actually doing that?
Yeah, so it may not be all bad, right? Some may have private health insurance from their civilian employer that they're very happy with and that they like using, and so they just don't use it for that reason. Others may have tried to use it once and had a bad experience and stopped going. Others may have heard horror stories from other veterans because, if you've been to one VA, you've been to one VA. Some are great. Some provide great health care and benefits assistance. Others, not so much. DC VA is a great example. Like I use it personally. It should be the Taj Mahal of VAs because of its proximity to Congress and the White House, but it consistently gets bad satisfaction surveys from veterans. So, so you may have bad experiences and hear horror stories from people that use VA and just decide, I don't want to deal with the bureaucracy and I don't want to deal with that issue.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And then like military retirees, if you did 20 years and retired, they're on TRICARE. So they're not even
right.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great point. So yeah, what I hear you saying is that all those veterans deserve representation.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it may not be a particular question about like if the House Veterans Affairs Committee is discussing a piece of legislation that has to do with community care, and the difference between care at VA versus community care, that may not be something that is particularly concerning to a veteran that doesn't use the VA. But our number one priority for the last few years has been suicide prevention because we routinely hear from veterans that we talk to that is their most important issue. And there are very few veterans that haven't been directly or indirectly affected by that issue. But we may ask a policy issue that, like, should the VA, right now, they view suicide prevention through the lens of mental health. And we may ask a question like, do you think that the Office of Suicide Prevention should be removed from the Office of Mental Health? Because suicide's not always a mental health issue. It usually is a conglomeration of like financial stress, relationship stress. Mental health can certainly play an important part of that, but it's not always a mental health problem. So that, policy question that we could ask has implications for how much money the VA puts towards suicide prevention outreach, which goes directly to the problem of veterans who aren't utilizing VA and take their life. How is the VA reaching them? When we may ask about other issues that have more direct impact to veterans that don't use the VA. And to be clear, we don't just have veterans on our list. Like you can identify as a caregiver, you can identify as a family member, but we have the ability to poll only the veterans or the larger community of supporters that people who are interested in veteran policy and want to say in how veterans are treated in this country.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing because it's like the veteran community is larger than just the folks who wore the uniform. I mean, the family members definitely are a super important constituency. People provide care. definitely an important constituency, because I think a lot of times they see things that, from a different perspective or a different lens that the veteran themselves might not be seeing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Like, for instance, like military housing is something that Congress can't seem to, the agencies or the services and Congress can't seem to get out of their own way, and they end up debating this at almost every single Congress. And it's something that affects military families. I mean, obviously, it also affects the veterans, but more so, it affects the military spouses and the kids that live in on-base housing, moldy barracks, things like that. That we can poll our supporters about something, a potential a policy that Congress or the Department of the Army or the Department of the Marine or the Department of the Navy is considering to try to alleviate those issues. So that's an example of an issue that yes affects veterans, but also affects the larger veteran community.
Definitely. So I'm hearing suicide awareness and prevention. I'm hearing military housing issues. What else is on the front burner for Mission Roll Call these days?
So access to care is a huge thing, as listeners may or may not know. Obviously in 2014, there was that huge scandal with the Phoenix VA wait list where veterans died on secret wait lists. That prompted Congress that same year to pass the Choice Act, which was the first piece of legislation that allowed the VA to use community providers as sort of a relief valve if they couldn't provide veterans at the VA the care they needed when they needed it and within a reasonable distance. That initial bill had like 6 different funding streams. It was a little convoluted. It was a little hard to navigate. Community care providers oftentimes had trouble getting reimbursed by VA. So Congress passed the Mission Act in 2018, which updated this piece of legislation. And since the Mission Act was passed, now community care accounts for roughly like over 1/3 of the VA's total spending on healthcare. And there are people in the community that debate the merits of, is VA, demonstrate, is it better than community care? Do veterans like using community care versus VA healthcare? There's a debate going on right there. And our main, not recommendation, but we've polled veterans pretty extensively on this. And it's clear that they like the care they get from VA, but despite that, they want their care regardless of if it's at the community or at the VA as soon as they can get an appointment and within a reasonable distance, right? So if the VA can't provide, they prefer care at the VA, but if the VA can't provide it, they want to be seen in the community, right? So we have presented members of Congress and particularly the House and Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. We testified last year about this issue and we presented that polling data to them because they're still debating this issue because the VA has had issues. It's the largest healthcare system in the country. So anytime Congress passes a wide sweeping piece of legislation, implementation is really hard because you have a huge agency where local and what are called VISNs have a lot of autonomy to run their organizations as they see fit. So long story short, we exist to provide feedback from the veteran community about their access to care issues, challenges, successes, what they want, because outreach in particular, right? And trying to make sure that veterans are getting the care they need when they need it. Because for those that actually use the VA, the roughly 50% that use the VA, one, we want to make sure that they don't have the horror stories that prevent the other veterans from coming to the VA and utilizing the care and services that they have. But two, we want to make sure that the issues that they have with VA don't become larger issues and ultimately contribute to our number one priority, which is veteran suicide. Because
Right.
if you have a healthcare issue, that is a huge burden on you and your family.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the second priority. So that's hot. That's huge right now. Um, Remains to be seen in an election year, how much Congress is gonna get done and
Yeah.
focus on. But that's what we're talking about, and we're trying to keep those issues front and center for members of Congress and the administration.
Awesome. Yeah. No, I think that's a really important distinction. Is that when you how many veterans? Let me back up a little bit. How many veterans do you represent?
We've got about 1.4 million that have
Wow.
opted into our polls.
Nice.
Now we don't usually poll all of them at the
Yeah.
same time. We do have the ability to get as granular as a particular zip code. So if one member of Congress wants to figure out, how the veterans feel in their district about their local VA or community-based outpatient clinic, are you satisfied? Right?
Yeah.
We can poll that district or we can poll that state, and on national level things, that's when we poll, a couple 100,000 at a time
Yeah.
about their issues. And with response rates, we usually get in the tens of thousands of responses. So
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, by representation size, 1.2 million puts you right up there with like the traditional VSOs, like the Legion of VFW. I mean, their
yeah.
membership rate is only about 1.2 million each, I think. So
Yeah, we've been. And I think part of it is because we're not asking we're not asking you to show up to a brick and mortar,
yeah.
place. Like this is something that you can sign up with on your phone,
Mhm.
or your computer, and our polls come to you, and it takes you 30 seconds to answer the polls. It's not a huge time commitment. Particularly like I have a 1-year-old, right?
Yeah.
And I don't have the time between my full-time job and having a 1-year-old, and other commitments to really take a lot of time to go to a
Yeah.
fraternal, or veteran organization and just sit around and talk about things and whatever. I've got plenty of stuff going on.
Yeah.
So it's easy for me to just respond to these polls and have my voice be heard. So I think that plays into it in the digital information age. It's
Yeah.
just easier for people to provide their voice this way.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I know it's like we've got a lot going on, and I think it's like just our generation's way of coming together, right? It's
Yeah.
a different way, but I think the vets I talk to are still looking for that same connection, even though if they might find it in different places than their grandparents did, right?
Yeah.
How do you see mission roll calls work contributing to a stronger America?
Well, I think the more veterans get involved in the policymaking process, one way or another, the better off we're all going to be. Veterans have, um, oftentimes out of necessity, come together. You have people from all different backgrounds, all different walks of life, coming together to accomplish a mission, to work together as a team, to overcome their differences, and to figure out how to move forward and to be
Yeah.
successful as a unit. As a branch, a service branch, to do that. And I think that intangible skill of being able to disagree without being disagreeable with each other is
Yeah.
something that we all could learn and benefit from. Because and studies show that veterans, when they get out, they're predisposed and more inclined to work in service kind of categories of jobs.
Yeah.
Firefighters, police officers, they're more inclined to donate to charitable organizations. They're more inclined to be involved in community organizations, civic efforts. This is a community that the more you empower them to make sure they have the tools they need to thrive and succeed,
Yeah.
it's going to benefit their communities. It's going to benefit your states and ultimately the country.
100%. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I stole that line from you about being able to disagree without being disagreeable to each other. And you told that to me a number of years ago, and it landed and took root. So
Yeah.
I thank you for that. And I think, that's a good reminder for everyone, because I think, when I go out into my community, you can watch the news and hear about like, oh, America's so divided. But, when I go to the post office, when I go to volunteer at the election polls, when I go to local businesses and walk on the streets of my community, I don't see it. I don't see that level of division. So I think one thing, you're talking about connection and human connection and meaningful connection to come together to kind of work on the problems that we have and make our communities and nation a better place.
100%.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's definitely not lost. I mean, we did that in the military. You and I did that in the Marine Corps, in the same organization. And I think a lot of other aspects of American society can kind of learn from that example of like putting differences aside, what's really important, and let's kind of come together to work on it. This might be a good segue into the Vet the Vote Coalition. I know Mission Roll Call joined us in 2022 and is a proud member. We're up to 37 organizations now in Vet the Vote. We started with 6 in 2022, and we recruited 63,500 in 2022, and we're looking at 100,000 this year. So could you tell us a little bit about why joining that effort was important to your organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just discussed it, right? The more veterans get involved in their communities and in the policymaking process, and frankly, the political process. We are a 501c3, so we are apolitical. We don't advocate for Republicans, Democrats, Independents, whatever. But veterans are geographically diverse. We're everywhere. We can stay calm in heated situations. Provide a level of comfort and security that the average civilian, I think the Department of the Department of Defense and veterans have one of the highest trust ratings amongst the general population. So, veterans getting involved in this process, which is also apolitical and which is also just trying to help our communities that are seeing this massive shortage in poll workers, has a direct effect on the health of our institutions and on our country. So it was a natural fit to try to get folks that want to get more involved. We did some marketing campaign back in 2022 to try to get people to sign up to be poll workers and just help and just be there in their communities. And it was a great way that you donate a relatively minimal amount of time to help your community and ultimately, state and country in a very direct way that is not political, and you don't have to show up and debate people. And I mean, you can if you want to, but you don't have to do that. It's very non-political, and it's a direct benefit on the strength of our institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we just had our primaries here in Virginia a couple weeks ago, and 3 out of 4 of the people running our polling station in our precinct were veterans. So it was great. It's you just feel good about making democracy happen for your fellow citizens, and it's like one of the few places where you got Republicans, Democrats, and Independents all coming together to do something good and positive for the country. And Well, Cole, any final thoughts for the audience? How can people get more involved if they're interested in supporting your efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say you can go to missionrollcall.org. Obviously, if you're a veteran or veteran adjacent, you're a spouse or caregiver, dependent, whatever, sign up for the polls that we send out. Obviously, feel free to donate if you want to make a donation. But then my final thought would just be, if you are a veteran, I would encourage you to vet the vote and go out and sign up to be a poll worker, because that's why we are part of the coalition, because it's important work and it's something that veterans are a natural fit for.
Awesome. Well, Cole, I've admired you and your work for many years now. Glad we met back in 2017, and
you too.
Excited to see what you'll be doing in the future. So thanks so much for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this podcast episode interesting or useful, please share it with the people you know. This episode was co-hosted by Joe Plensler and Ellen Gustafson. The audio and video were edited by King's Collab Studios. This podcast is a production of We the Veterans and Military Families, a 501c3 not-for-profit, non-partisan, veteran and military spouse-led organization focused on promoting positive and patriotic civic engagement to strengthen American freedom and liberty. Find out more about us at wetheveterans.us and follow us on social media.